The VCT Americas 2025 season is 2 weeks away. We are about to end 2024, and it's time to talk about what the 2025 season is going to look like for all 12 teams in the Americas region. We will be going through every single team one by one, talking about their new additions, what they did in the offseason, how their offseason went, and also looking back at 2024 and see what their best placements were and how they can improve. So this is the board we have today. As I said, we have all 12 teams here. So we will be starting from the top left and ending on the bottom right, which means we are starting with Energy. So looking at Energy, they went through quite a bit of change in the offseason. They lost 3 members of their previous roster, losing Demon One, even though he was benched halfway through the season, so you could take that as a mid-season loss. And I didn't put down all the mid-season removals from rosters that a lot of teams had, because I felt like that would just add too much space and it wasn't really necessary. But Demon One was still technically on the organization until the end of the 2024 season. He ends up moving on to Leviatan, but they also lose the 2 members that were on the Optic core in Crashies and Victor. So they ended up bringing back FNS and Som halfway through the season to try to salvage their season, but it did not work. And now they've gone through quite a bit of change where those 2 members that were on the Optic core, that was probably the best team of 2022, at least one of the best teams. So we can no longer talk about how that Optic core is still together, because at this point it is very split up. But Crashies has made his way over to EMEA to play on Fnatic, at least until Leo is back. We'll see where his health is. And kicking Victor off, Victor had a really down season in 2024, was probably one of the worst players on the roster, but he definitely had his moments of brilliance. Victor is a really good player. He was a great flex player, especially at his peak, but it just seemed like the magic just wasn't there this season. They also got rid of their coach Chet, but I didn't want to go through all the coaching changes that happened, but that is a big, at least, change for Energy. As soon as FNS wasn't on the team anymore, it felt like Chet just didn't really have the same runway to find success in this team that they did previously. And even once they brought back FNS, it was just too late to save their season. They didn't have a lot of time to fix what was broken. So the players they end up bringing in during the offseason are Verno and Mada, and they also brought in a new coach, Bonkar, who was Verno's coach. That was on the tier 2 team of Oxygen Esports. And their best placement of 2024 was 3rd, 4th at kickoff. They were 1 match away from making it to Madrid, but they did lose to Sentinels, who ended up winning Madrid. So it wasn't really too big of a deal at the time, but it was at least the start of this team just having a really mediocre year. This new Energy team does look very solid. What they've done in the offseason is nothing short of impressive. They've only lost 1 match during the offseason. They won the Sin City Classic tournament as well as the Super League Valorant tournament. So they've definitely looked solid, but off-season events are just off-season events. A lot of people will bring up Sentinels from last year where they had very good. They actually won those 2 tournaments the year prior, and then they rode that into winning Madrid. So Energy, I think they have the ability to do that, but I definitely want to see a little bit more. These are 2 very talented tier 2 players that they've brought in. Verno has looked insane so far. Mada has looked strong as well. Ethan is picking up where he left off after a pretty good season on a bad team last year, despite having his struggles as IGL. His individual performance was quite good. And for FNS, this is his last year of professional Valorant, so there is a lot riding on this team to have a good year and try to win a tournament. I definitely think they are one of the better teams in the Americas. I don't know if they're the best one, but at this point, I'd probably put them top 3, but we'll see where I place them on my power rankings. But for now, I definitely have high hopes in this Energy roster. Moving on, we have Evil Geniuses, a team that also went through quite a bit of change in the offseason. The removals in the offseason are Apoth and Jogmo. Jogmo making his way over to G2. Apoth at this point does not have a team, so what they ended up doing is essentially switching duelist players with G2 and picking up Icy, as well as bringing Ye back to the Americas region. So maybe he can find some 2022 magic, but I think the focus for Ye should just be work on your confidence and just try to get to a point where you are a solid player, but you're not just, this insane monster that everybody was expecting him to be in the past. I think expectations for Ye should be low, but I think that that's a good thing, because if these expectations are low, then he can exceed them easily. So I have confidence in Ye this year, and now he's being coached by Potter, who just signed an extension with Evil Geniuses. So maybe this combo of this coach and this player in Ye, if it goes well, then we could see them be together for quite a long time. And when it comes to Icy, I think that's a good addition as well. When you're looking for replacements for Jogamo, there are definitely worse players to choose. They were looking at picking up Sim in the offseason, but he ended up not performing very well at the Sin City Classic, which seemed to be his tryout for the team. So I guess that performance didn't impress them enough to have the organization buy out his contract from TSM, so he is back on that roster. roster. But honestly, I think Icy is just the better pick there. I think while he did have an inconsistent year on G2, he was improving a lot by the end of it. So I think Potter is going to do wonders for this kid. For the best placement in 2024, similar to Energies, they had a 3rd to 4th placement at kickoff, but they only won one match. They were the team that had the bye round in that just god-awful format for a kickoff tournament, but it was kind of the only option that Riot had, really. But they ended up having a surprise win over G2 in that bracket, but they could not beat Loud, who went on to qualify for Madrid and place top 4. So I definitely think that this Evil Geniuses roster is better than last year's, despite losing Jogamo. Yes, you're losing your best player in Jogamo, but I think this roster overall looks a lot stronger just across the board on paper. What they essentially did last year is have a bunch of unproven players and players that need a rehabilitation, such as Derek, and they did a good job getting the most out of those players. But I think now if you look at them on paper, aside from Jogamo losing, I think this team is at least a little bit deeper with EA and Icy on it. Derek had a bounce back season. We'll see if he can continue that Superman decent performance as well, and they still have Nature as their IGL. So while I don't think this team is going to be sniffing top 3, I think they have a chance to potentially qualify for a tournament at some point. I'm not expecting that to happen, but I am expecting them to be a competitive team. This is definitely a team that should be at least, upsetting some teams that have high expectations. So we will see what Potter can do. Moving on, we have Kru, the Latin American team that is usually just inconsistent throughout the year, but always ends up making it champions. They did do that for the 4th champions in a row last year, and they ended up making some changes in the offseason after that. In terms of players that are no longer on the roster, and I'm putting lost, but I don't mean that as like, oh, all these teams were trying to bring these players back and they lost them. I just mean that's the players that are no longer on the team, just to clarify that. But in terms of players they no longer have, that is Heat and Klaus find themselves outside of the roster. Heat makes his way over back to a Brazilian team on Furia, and Klaus at this point does not have a team. He was removed from the roster during stage 2 when they wanted to bring MTA back in, and MTA isn't on the roster either, but he's still listed as the sub, so I didn't put him down here. So maybe they just want him in that position. We'll see. In terms of additions, well, they brought back Mazzino, a player that has previously played for them and then went to Leviatan and had the best year of his life last year, and now he's back on Kru. I don't know if I'm expecting Mazzino to have the same year on Kru that he did on Leviatan. I think that might be a career year for Mazzino, because I think throughout his career he's been known as a very solid Latin American player, but not necessarily a player that's like sniffing like top 5 in the world or whatever, but he at times was playing to that level last year. But I could be completely wrong about him, and he continues a strong run. And they also have a new IGL in Adverso, coming over from the Latin American Tier 2 team in All Knights, a team that did pretty well at the Ascension tournament but couldn't beat M80 in a 5-map game. He was also previously on Leviatan, so that continues the streak of these two teams swapping players just back and forth. If Adverso can be a really solid IGL for them, I think the heights of this team are pretty high. They still have some amazing talent in both Kesnet and Shy, and a great depth piece in Melzer, who can also IGL for them as well. But I think the problem last year is that they kept just swapping IGLs back and forth, so I really hope Adverso is just that answer and they just keep it that way for the entire year. Their best placement of 2024 was 3rd at stage 2, where they qualified for champions, so I could have put their champions placement, but they got grouped, so I felt like just putting stage 2 was I guess a stronger pick for the 2024 placement. Kru's a good team. I've had confidence in this team for quite a while in terms of Latin American teams. They are the one that I root for the most. But I don't know, just something about this roster every year just kind of seems like they're going to be mid or at least inconsistent. I think this is a good roster, and Mazzino on paper is a good addition if you just look at last year, but as I said, will he continue that? Kesnet is a great talent, but he has proven to have a pretty inconsistent career at this point. Can he break that, find consistency, and get his team to qualify for not just one international and then get grouped at that international? If this team can find consistency, then I think they'll be okay, but they have a lot of competition to pass over, so it's going to be just a dogfight for those spots for internationals. Moving on to a Brazilian team, we have MIBR, one of the more interesting teams to talk about in the offseason, which was not what I would have predicted heading into the offseason. In terms of players they got rid of, basically everybody except for Art Scene. They got rid of Lizy, Mazine, Pala, and Rich. And in terms of additions, some really big names here in Ospas and Noswer, and the other players that they brought in are Xenom and Cortesia. Now, we already know how good Ospas is. He is one of, if not the best players in the world, one of the best duelists ever to play the game. He has had one of the most consistent careers in Valorant's history. Not a lot of other players have been playing at his level for as long as he has. Can he continue that? I definitely think he can. I think that's one of the more guaranteed things, but hey, time catches up with everybody, so it's not guaranteed that everybody, just based off their talent, is going to have a good year from one year to the next. But if there's any safe bet, it's Ospas. And Noswer is a player that Ospas wanted to play with on Leviatan, so that didn't happen because he was kicked off the team on Christmas Eve, which is just a hilarious Christmas present and something you should not do if you're trying to build a winner, Leviatan. But Noswer should be a very good addition to this roster. When he eventually got a roster spot on Furia, he had a pretty good year on a team that was just abysmal for most of the year. Definitely helping that team get some wins in Stage 2 that maybe they didn't deserve. This team has only played in one off-season event so far. It was an online invitational with a bunch of Brazilian and Latin American teams, and MIBR ended up going to the grand finals of that. They did lose to Furia, but I don't think that that means that Furia is a better team than MIBR, but we'll talk about Furia later. But at that tournament, Cortesia had an amazing run, having I think a 53% headshot percentage, which is just insane. I think he had 73% in a game against Loud, so maybe we have a new Scream on our hands where this guy just one-taps everyone. I do kind of want to dampen expectations a little bit for him because a lot of people are really excited for this player after seeing that, and I am too. I think he's going to be good. However, I'm going to say he's probably not going to have that headshot percentage throughout the entire season. Having it at one tournament I don't think is a huge indication of, you know, he's going to just do that all the time. But at the very least, it shows that he has very good aim, so he seems to be a really good addition to this roster so far. I'm confident that this kid's going to be good. And for Xenom, haven't heard too much about him yet, but we will see how he does. He seems to be pretty respectable death piece at this point, so we will see how this works. I really want this team to have good chemistry. If this team can get chemistry, then they have the talent to be a very dangerous team and a sleeper pick for making internationals. In terms of their best placement last year, they did get 6th at kickoff, where they actually had a pretty decent run during that tournament, and it made me a lot more confident in that team than what ended up happening, being able to beat teams like C9 and G2. So it seemed like they were on the right path, and then things just fell apart during Stage 1. So they're going to want to avoid that happening to them again. This is a completely different roster. Only Artsin is the only one joining, and I think he's going to thrive with the pressure off of him, with Ospas being the main duelist player now. Really curious to see where this team goes. This is one to watch for sure. Moving on, we have the newest addition to the VCT Americas League, and that is Kru Esports. Not much to go off of roster changes. They only added one player in Gobera, but he was only added to be the stopgap until Spike is able to play. He is not of age to play in the VCT yet, so when he is, he will be put back in. He's too good to not play, but maybe Gobera can be a good stopgap for now, and Silence can maybe take over that main duelist position. He's a Sentinel duelist player. So we'll see what ends up happening up there with the roles. Their offseason hasn't really been too exciting. They only played in that online invitational that I was talking about, but they didn't have Zap for that one, which is a pretty big loss. He's your IGL and your leader, so not, you know, the best judgment of how this team's going to be, but they were still able to be Loud and Tier 2 team. They did lose to Kru 0-2, but hey, maybe that means they're at least better than Loud. In terms of best placement in 2024, well, of course, it was the one match that made them be able to be here, and that is getting first at Ascension. So I think this team is maybe a sleeper pick to be competitive, but I'm not really expecting much from them. They did come out of nowhere during that Ascension tournament, but was that just one good tournament, or are they actually a good team that can be consistent? I think we'll probably see them be an inconsistent team until Spike comes in, and then maybe they get some wins over teams that should on paper beat them. But I'm excited to see where they go. I think the Brazilian Tier 2 scene is pretty solid at this point. We saw that at that Ascension tournament. So this is 2 games time to prove that they can be the best Brazilian team. There is a lot of competition now, but that spot is wide open because Loud is definitely not near where they used to be. So hey, nothing's impossible. 2 game, maybe they can be competitive. Very excited to see how they do. Moving on, we have 100 Thieves. Not much to talk about when it comes to changes here as well. They only lost 1 player and added 1. That loss is Bang, of course, and they added Xander in the offseason. So Xander is essentially just that controller replacement, and you could definitely do worse. I feel like in terms of skill level, both Bang and Xander are pretty 1-1. Xander's been around around for a while. He gets another chance at a tier 1 spot. He was previously on teams like V1, and he's been on M80 for the past 2 years waiting for his chance at tier 1. So this is his time. Hopefully he can prove that he was the right choice. In terms of best placements in 2024, they did win America's Stage 1, but they also got 4th at Shanghai, so I thought that was more worth mentioning. That placement was them already being in the playoff stage and being able to beat a couple teams to get to that 4th spot, but then they just got dumpstered on by Team Heretics. So they're going to be hoping, if they are able to get to another international under the leadership of their coaching staff, Zeeks, as well as Boostio as their IGL, they're going to be hoping for a better placement and maybe a bit more consistent play at that level, because sometimes they just had really bad maps. This team still has some really good talent. Asuna, inconsistent year in 2024, but there still is something there. Cryo had a bounce back year from his 2023 season. Excited to see how he does this year. There is a lot of good about this team. I'm just not sure if I'm as hyped on them as I would have been in previous years. I felt like what we saw of this team at the end of the year in both Stage 2 and that Stage 2 playoffs is a bit more indicative of what they are than the team that ended up winning Stage 1. They have some players that have had their chance for a while now, but haven't proven that they can, really reach some high heights. Asuna comes to mind in that. Asuna has been on this roster for a while now. They've built multiple different teams around him. This is his time to shine. I don't know how long his contract ends. I'm pretty sure it's more than 1 year, so maybe 100 Thieves just completely believes in him and wants him on the roster for as long as possible. But I feel like if 100 Thieves has another mid-season, I don't know if Asuna would deserve that spot. But hey, maybe he's the best player and they still fall short, so, I could be completely wrong in that. But 100 Thieves, there is something there. There is some good talent. Do I see them as like a top 3 team? No, I at this point, I don't feel that for them. Moving on, we have Leviatan, a team that was talked about a lot at the beginning of the offseason, but for not the reason that they would have wanted. They were losing both of their best players in 2024 in Ospas and Mazzino. Ospas now going to MIBR, Mazzino now on Kru. So in terms of replacements, they did do, I think, pretty well, at least as well as they could have. They get Demon 1 from Energy. So him as an Ospas replacement, you have a guy that was once one of the best players in the world when he had that amazing run on Evil Geniuses, and you have Natank, who makes his way over from EMEA. He was on the Gentlemates roster. Don't know too much about him because Gentlemates was a pretty irrelevant team last year, but I've heard good things about him. In terms of their best placement, they were one of the top 3 teams at Champions, getting 3rd, losing to Team Heretics in the lower final, which I think definitely came as a surprise to some. While they were a very strong team in Americas last year, they definitely had their points of being inconsistent. I think Nasra being kicked off the team kind of gave a kind of awkward aura to this team at the beginning of the year, which is definitely not what you want, especially when you have a player like Ospas, who, when he's on, is the best player in the world. So not trying to keep him happy, at least not doing it properly, I think that is just a terrible look on the organization. But they were still a really good team. They still have most of those pieces, at least 3 out of the 5, so maybe there's still something there. King is a really good player. He's an IGL that can put up some pretty solid numbers, so that's a valuable thing to have. I'm expecting Demon 1 to have a comeback. He does look like me, apparently. I get many comments about that. I kind of see it. But when Demon 1 was on in 2023, he was nearly unstoppable. So if Leviatan can get that out of him, then they don't care about losing Ospas because you have Demon 1 at his best. I definitely think he was done dirty by Energy. I don't think they put him in the right position. I think they kind of gave him a bit too much responsibility with how the team played. It just wasn't a system that was set up for success for most of those players, and I'm glad Energy's not doing that this year. It seems like they have learned from their mistakes. So hopefully Leviatan has learned from them. Apparently what they've been trying is Demon 1 on Smokes and then putting Tex back on the duelist role. He was previously playing on G2. So I think that makes a lot of sense because that was kind of my confusion with them picking up Tex the year prior, because I was like, well, he just had his best year that he's had in Valorant on Duelist, and now you're putting him on things like Initiator, and I'm not sure if that's exactly what you should be doing. Tex ended up having a pretty good year, but I still kind of felt that he wasn't playing to his strengths. At least the roster wasn't allowing him to do that. So now if you put him on the Duelist role, you put Demon 1 on Smokes, I think there's something there. I think there's something to that and could work out very well. And I think there's some flexibility there. You could put Demon 1 on Duelist sometimes, maybe run a double Duelist comp with Tex playing Raze, Demon 1 playing Jet, something like that. They have a roster that can be flexible, and that's a valuable thing to have. I think this team has some pretty good pieces and could be a sleeper dark horse kind of pick. There is going to be a lot for this team to prove because now they don't have the best player in the world. That will be a talking point around this team, so they're going to have to shut those up with some pretty strong play. So We will see. I think they can do it. Moving on, we have a team that has seemingly fallen from the heights that they used to reach, and that is Loud. They lost 2 long-standing members of the team, Sadak, their star IGL that has been on the team since 2022, and Les, another player that had been on the roster for a very long time, being a part of that incredible 2022 roster that won champions. Both of those players make their way over to Europe, Sadak going to Carmine Corp, Les going to Team Vitality. So what they ended up doing is going a bit budget, going to some tier 2 players. They go to Vinny, he will be their new IGL, and they also bring in Digizin, a player that had previously been on Furia in 2023 but played in tier 2 last year. So it's not like they're just bringing in players that don't have tier 1 experience. Their best placement in 2024 was 4th at Madrid, a tournament that they placed high, but it wasn't like they were beating world beater teams. They were only able to beat Chinese teams that at that tournament were not performing very well. Anytime they played a different team, like the rematch against Sentinels or playing Paper Rex, they just couldn't really get much going. They were playing some wacky comps like their Phoenix Breach thing that they did on, I think, 2 to 3 different maps. It ended up getting them far early in the year, but as soon as teams started to figure out those compositions, it kind of just fell apart. When you're playing against top tier talent, you need more than a couple different funky surprises to get far. Digizin is definitely an interesting pickup. I thought he was a pretty solid player on Furia the year prior, but there was apparently problems within the roster and other stuff going on where Digizin did find himself outside of a spot. But he definitely has his moments. He has the skill, but maybe isn't the most consistent player. But he might be an upgrade on the duelist position they had the year prior, where they had Quick playing it for at least the first half of the year until they dropped him. But with Vinny, I don't think that you can make the argument that he is an improvement on Sadak. Sadak seemed to not care as much as the year went on, which was definitely unfortunate, but that's how it goes. But I'm not going to put the losses on him. He didn't have the roster that he had before. He tried things out and then he left it to the coaches, and the coaches couldn't figure it out. So even though I've seen some people call me out for saying, oh, you just think Brazilian tier 2 players are awful and that North American tier 2 is way better. Never have said that ever. But what I will say, if you look at Loud on paper and their so far pretty poor offseason results, this team just looks a lot worse than what it used to. They still have some good talent in players that were there prior in Kawazin, Tuiz, and Pancata, but both Tuiz and Kawazin were not on the champions winning roster. They came in 2023, and they are still great players, but it's not like the same roster that won champions. The only remaining piece of that team is Pancata, who's a good player, but seems to be a little bit past his prime, but he is still quite good. This team has a chance. There are some good things here. I just don't think they're going to be a extremely competitive team. I'm not expecting them to go very far. I'm not really expecting great placements out of them, but we have seen crazier things. Moving on to the bottom left, we have G2. In terms of roster changes, as previously stated, they basically just traded duelists with evil geniuses. They now have Jogamo, they now have Icy, and I think that it was really smart of G2 to just make that one move. They had a roster that did very well last year. Their best placement in 2024 was 3rd at Shanghai, which was a placement that not a lot of people expected them to get to. What was impressive about G2 last year was just how much they improved throughout the year. They started the year with a pretty mediocre performance at kickoff, only being able to beat Kru during that time. They technically beat Sentinels, but it wasn't a real victory. And then in stage 1, they looked pretty mediocre. I think they had a 3-3 record heading into playoffs, but they still got there, and then they had a good playoff run. And then they had a great run at Shanghai, unfortunately lost to Team Heretics, who were just on a mission to get to that grand final. They went all the way to the grand finals of the playoffs in stage 2. They just can't seem to win best of 5s. They have a 1-3 record on them in the 2024 season. Anytime it was a 5 map game, they just could not win, except for that one time against Leviatan, but Leviatan got the revenge in stage 2, so they just kept being runner-ups, which was very unfortunate for them. So if they can make it to those long matches again and show that they improved and learned from that, then this team absolutely has the ability to win an international. They have an incredibly good system. The style of Valorant that they played last year, a lot of people didn't like it, which I understood, but it was getting them wins. I think this year they're going to play a bit more exciting. Now they have Jogamo, who's a lot more aggressive, so I think they knew what they were getting with Jogamo and want to play a bit more fast. But either way, I think it's good to play fast, but also play very disciplined and smart. And that was a strength of them. When a lot of teams just like peek corners that maybe they shouldn't, or try to get kills in places that maybe they should just stay back, that's a flaw that G2 doesn't seem to have a lot of. So that's a very important thing to win games. And now you can play a bit faster with Jogamo. You still have Trent, you still have Joan and Pete. You have one of the best IGLs in the world in Valen. There is not a lot to hate. I did even mention Leaf in there, who had a very good year on the Sentinel role. So this team is set up for success. I think they're one of the top 3 teams in the region. Do I think they're the best? wait for the power rankings video for that one. Moving on, we have Furia, a team that had a pretty abysmal year in 2024. Their best placement was 10th at stage 2, so barely beating out last place in the region. This was a team that built a roster that you could look at it and see, well, they have some talent. They have MW Zera, there's this Havoc guy coming in, maybe there's some good pieces here, but it ended up just not working for most of the season. They had a decent stage 2, they actually had a pretty okay record, but it just wasn't enough for them to, get into any playoff spot or anything. So they ended up making not too big of changes, but some changes that definitely add some firepower. In terms of negations, they lose Noswer and Zand, and in terms of additions, they bring in Heat and Rafa. Losing Noswer isn't the biggest deal, but he is a good player, so that definitely hurts. Zand had a not very good run when he was on the team, at least from individual performances. But with Heat coming in, I think that's a great addition. He's a good energy guy. He can maybe get this team wins that they otherwise wouldn't get. And Rafa seems to be their new IGL. So far, this team's offseason has gone pretty well, actually. They played in that same online invitational tournament as MIBR, Loud, and Kru played in, and they ended up winning the whole thing against MIBR in the grand finals. Granted, all the games that they won were 2-1 wins, so you could see that as them getting a bit lucky, maybe not being the best at their map pool or whatnot, but that could just be some growing pains with the new roster. I'm not expecting that tournament to be an indication of how good all of those teams are, but it is at least a decent showcase of these players. So if you're going to have faith in MIBR because of that tournament, you should maybe put a little faith in Furia as well. I don't know if this team is going to get themselves out of the basement this year, but there is a chance. They got some talent, and they're probably tired of losing. They've done a lot of that in Valorant over the past 2 years. Moving on, we have C9, a team that very recently put together a proper roster. In terms of negations, they lose technically just 3 players from last year in Vanity, Rooney, and Moose. But as we all know, they picked up Rossi and ended up dropping him a month before the season, and they were going to keep Moose and dropped him a week after Rossi. At the start of the offseason, they brought in Vic, previously of MXS, and they also, after the Rossi and Moose negations, they bring in Mitch as their new IGL, returning to this roster, and they bring in Net, previously of G2 and M80. This team is just incredibly frustrating to talk about because they're a team that does have some really good talent. They have Oxy on the team, who is one of the best talents in Valorant right now. He just wasn't surrounded by a team that could make it to an international last year. So I think if we see Oxy at an international, we can see this guy just absolutely go off, and then more people will talk about him like some other people that are high on him are. But the team that they've surrounded him with, I look at it the same way as it did last year, and I'm just like, it just looks mid. If they had maybe brought in Rossi, Vic, and Net, that's something that I'm like, okay, now we're kind of cooking here. You got some good tier 2 talent. You got Net, who was on a team that won Ascension, on a team that almost won Ascension. He is a good addition. I have seen a lot of praise for that pickup so far, but we will see. Net is a good player, but there is a reason why he found himself outside of G2. He definitely has had his inconsistencies. And Vic, good player as well, but he was on a team that, fell a little bit short of expectations. But hey, so did Verno and Mata on their respective tier 2 teams, Mata being on the same team as Vic. And Mitch as an IGL, I mean, maybe he'll play more in the style that C9 apparently wanted to when they had a problem with how Rossi was calling. But to me, all the problems with Rossi, especially seeing the interview with Rossi afterwards and seeing how it was talked about and how everything went down, all of it seemed very fixable. So Rossi looked like their best player in the offseason events that they played. And aside from, the Sin City Classic, where the team just wasn't playing very well. And then the team went to the grand finals at Red Bull Home Ground, which they seem to do every year, so don't put too much stock in that. But now the roster that was playing well at that tournament is basically no more. It's completely different, nearly. The best placement at 2024 was 5th to 6th at both Stage 1 and Stage 2, where they made the playoffs, but they were in a single elimination match, and then they lost it. Every year, this team seems to do the same exact thing, where they start the year pretty poorly, they make a roster change, they have a good mid-season, they look like one of the best teams in the Americas, and then they just completely crap the bed when it comes to playoff time. And then the later part of the season in Stage 2, they look pretty mid, and then they get to playoffs again, and they lose. So can they break that pattern? Part of me hopes they do, and part of me just doesn't like this org anymore, which is how they treat players like just a rotating door and just being like, oh, well, we're going to choose this player's not working, this thing does, we don't like this guy, so we're going to kick him out 2 weeks before the season, and then we're going to do this, bring in this guy. Oh, well, we once had this guy before, so let's bring him back. I just think it's a terrible way to run a roster. If there was problems with Rossi, you should have figured them out earlier in the offseason. And it seemed like something that was fixable. So I'm cheering for Oxy because I like Oxy, and I don't wish ill will on the actual players on the team, but with this org, I just don't want them to win. I really want Oxy to just move on to a different team, and then I can cheer for him in a different jersey, because I don't know, I'm getting really tired of this Cloud9 team. But hey, if they end up making a roster change, there's plenty of good players available. You know, there's Vanity out there. I know Rooney's out there. You got, you know, Curry. He's probably an option. Jakey, he would love a tier 1 spot. I've heard Moose is available, Rossi potentially as well. So hey, there's options if they want to make roster changes. There's plenty of good players out there. Last but not least, we have Sentinels. Sentinels are a very interesting team. In terms of negations from the roster, they lose 2 players to retirement. TenZ, of course, being the most popular Valorant player in the world, a long-standing member of the Sentinels roster, basically the face of the organization. And Saucy on this team for 2 seasons now, previously of the Loud 2022 roster that won champions, so a veteran with a lot of pedigree. That is definitely not something that you're going to, you know, easily replace. However, when it comes to additions, on paper, they did pretty well. They bring in Narrate, who was previously of Carmine Corp, and they bring in Bang, previously of 100 Thieves. Narrate had a really good year on Carmine Corp, which did come as a bit of a surprise because the year prior he was on a pretty poor tier 1 North American team in Mad Lions, but he was a good player on them, so they ended up giving him a chance over in Europe, and then he proved the doubters wrong. And on Sentinels so far in the offseason, his personal performance has been pretty strong. However, his addition does kind of present a bit of a roster issue with this team. What they've been trying in the offseason so far is Kaplan has been putting John QT on the initiator role, and in theory, that's a better place to put your IGL, while they've been putting Narrate on the Sentinel role. So John QT played Sentinel last year. I don't know how much initiator he played, but he was mainly like a Cypher player. And Bank is a bit of more of a traditional smokes player than TenZ was, so I've seen the argument that it makes Sentinels better with Bang coming in over TenZ, but I'm sorry, TenZ was the much better player throughout his entire career, so I disagree with that, but Bang is still a good addition, so maybe you'll get him playing more than just one controller, because TenZ just played Omen when he was playing controller, but you lose a lot of that top-end talent in TenZ, but you're hoping to replace that with just by and large options like Narrate and Bang. But Narrate, while his personal performance has been pretty solid overall, I still don't think you're playing to his strengths by putting him on Sentinel. Kaplan is a good coach, so I do trust him with his team, but I definitely thought some of the roster decisions at the end of last year were kind of questionable. We saw John QT playing Deadlock, which some players in some teams have made it work, and maybe Deadlock becomes more meta, but I'm still not crazy about that pick. So to me, it was Kaplan trying out these things to maybe try to surprise people and other teams, but it just didn't always work. And as soon as they kind of put John QT on more traditional Sentinels, it worked a lot better, and then they got 4th at that Champions tournament. So Kaplan sometimes makes those interesting composition decisions that do kind of frustrate me, but I understand the vision. We'll see if Narrate continues to play on the Sentinel role and John QT continues to play on Initiator, but if we're going just off of the Soup League tournament that they just played in, it might not be the best decision. But hey, offseason is offseason. They still have time to figure it out. And I still think this team is quite good. Their best placement in 2024 was, of course, winning Madrid. It was a fantastic run. It was a very difficult run. They had to go through the lower bracket. They didn't win all the games, but they won where it mattered most, and they got the job done and won that tournament, and then had a really good run at Champions. They didn't make it to Shanghai. They had a bit of a mid-season downer there, but they were still a solid team. I think this team's great. Their talent cannot be understated. They have some very, very solid Valorant players. I just don't know if we're going to see the same heights as we did last year. Maybe they end up being a bit more consistent than they did last year. Maybe their midseason isn't poor like it was last year, but they're going to have to be better than a lot of different teams that have more solid composition ideas than them. So we will see what happens. Sentinels, I have a lot of faith in them. We're definitely going to see them at internationals. That is my belief, but I don't know if they're going to win one. I think it'd be cool if they did, especially after 10. So this new era winning would be very special to both the team and the fan base. But it is not going to be easy because, as I've talked about, there are plenty of good teams in this region. This is going to be an absolute dogfight for those spots. So that is my VCT Americas 2025 season preview. Let me know in the comment section down below, which teams do you think are going to be the best? Who do you think is going to be the top teams in this region? Let me know all that in the comment section down below. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.